Welcome to the Stetzer Church Leaders Podcast. Conversations with today's top ministry leaders to help you lead better every day. And now, podcasting from the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center in Chicagoland, here are your hosts, Ed Stetzer and Daniel Yang.
Well, welcome to the Stetzer Church Leaders Podcast, where we're helping Christian leaders navigate and lead through the cultural issues of our day. My name's Daniel, the director of the Send Institute, and we're excited to have with us today Sho Baraka. Sho is a globally recognized recording artist, culture curator, activist, and writer. His work combines his artistic platform with his academic history to contribute a unique perspective, elevating the contemporary conversation on faith, art, and culture. Sho is also the co-founder of 4th District and the AND campaign, and he served as adjunct professor at Wake Forest School of Divinity. His recent book is entitled, He Saw That It Was Good, Reimagining Your Creative Life to Repair a Broken World, which we're really excited to jump into today. But before we hear from Sho Baraka, I want to remind you about the Amplify Outreach Conference coming October 19th and 20th. Amplify Outreach is designed for pastors and Christians passionate about entering the real issues of our day and helping people discover authentic faith in Christ. So be sure to learn more about the conference at amplifyoutreach.com. Now let's go to our host, editor-in-chief of Outreach Magazine and the executive director of the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center, and also somebody who just discovered today.
Stop, don't do
that
this.
Sho Baraka and Dahadi Lewis are
They're
brothers.
brothers. And I like, look right here,
Stetzer.
right here. What do you see right here? What do you see right here on my phone? Right?
It says
That's
Sho Baraka.
So literally, like, I did not know
You did
that this is like, I mean, I thought maybe brothers in Christ, so there's that. But
like Zoolander says, black people are brothers as black people use it.
Yeah, but there you go. Fair. Okay. So we are excited to have this conversation with you, Sho. And we were talking before we came on that, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, we, before you were famous, I knew you before you were famous, before there was a little gray in that beard. And there was no gray in mine, thanks to some product. But that's another story for another day. But super excited to hear. And you've got a new book. It's your debut book, right? And of course, some of you are familiar with Sho's music, but now stepping into a new place. The book is called He Saw That It Was Good. And if people haven't picked it up yet, we want to encourage them to. But tell us about it. The premise, the inspiration, what brought you to write it?
Yeah, I mean, the premise is basically my, I guess you could say, theological approach to faith, work, and creativity. That's the elevator pitch. But the impetus for it is my whole life I've struggled with calling and what it meant to do what I felt like God was designing or pushing me towards, and where there was need. And oftentimes I felt, because the influential people in my life worked in vocational Christian spaces, that I needed to do that in order to make real impact. And a lot of the theology around being excellent in the marketplace, or being faithful, having a Christian fidelity, but also being excellent in culture creating, it was anemic. That theology was anemic. And so when I started to mature in my faith and stumble across more theology or work and people who were exercising their faith in spaces that weren't just in the church or in vocational Christian spaces, I wanted to take this theology and take these concepts and give it to people who I knew were like me, artists, creatives, and even people who worked in the marketplace but didn't feel like they had a robust theology to catalyze them to great work and to be missionaries in the marketplace, if you will.
You write in the book that you didn't grow up in church. I'm wondering if you can just share a little bit about your background, your family, your history, and then talk about how coming to faith really changed your outlook on creativity.
Yeah, so grew up in a house where we worshiped football because my father played professional football. I was actually born in Canada. He started his football career in Canada, playing in Calgary. Then he got picked up by the New Orleans Saints, so we moved to New Orleans. So I lived in New Orleans and then moved back to California. I'll save you some of the salacious details of my life as a young man doing young man things. Then my older brother, Dahadi, who
that's his brother. Dahadi Lewis is his brother. You know that? Okay.
Yeah.
We share the same. We share the same middle name, but I go by it as if it's my last name. But yes, my name is Sho Baraka Lewis, but his name is Dahadi Baraka Lewis. So anyway, he became a Christian when I was in high school while he was at college. And he being one of the people who had a great influence in my life, would share the gospel with me around the same time my father became a Christian. And so I am just wrestling with, what does it mean to love hip hop music? What does it love to love film? I went to school to study film. What does it mean to love the culture that God has given us to in order to, flourish society, while at the same time love him? And so I became a Christian, but I just was like, well, I need to just lose all these affections and affinities I have and just become a campus minister at campus outreach or crusade or something. And when I realized that you had to raise support, I was like, nope, that's not for me. And so
Actually, as a former applicant to be a campus outreach campus minister 30 years ago, that support raising was a little much.
yeah, it was rough. I actually went on much love to a mentor at the time, Byron Johnson, great guy. He took me on a support raising trip with him, and I saw the grueling work. I was like, it takes more faith in to raise support than it does to believe in Jesus. I was like, I don't know if I can handle this. So, but yeah. So anyway, I through counsel of people, they encouraged me to follow after the path of being a creative. I fell in love with folks like Phyllis Wheatley and C.S. Lewis and Chesterton and different folks who were great creatives, but also had a strong faith. And around that same time, I was roommates with individuals like Tadashi and Lecrae, and at the University of North Texas, and we decided to start a record label, or in a movement. At the time, we weren't trying to start a movement, but it was just a group of individuals who loved the Lord and were obnoxious about it, and call it 116 Click. And so that was birthed through my brother's Bible study, college ministry. A lot of people don't know that. So Dahadi's college ministry, which was known as Plumline, kind of cultivated myself, Lecrae, Tadashi, and other Christian hip hop artists, because we also had a connection to the cross movement. So in all of this, in this cauldron of faithfulness, while also like artistic talent, I started to see a way for which my talents and my gifting could be used. And so my pursuit of those things became more clear and more passionate, I guess you can say. And so that's kind of like the trajectory of how I came to know the Lord to where I am now, if you will.
Yeah, and I love your emphasis through the book and just what I've known of you for years is the power of stories. And now you're writing here, and I mean, most of us know you as a hip hop artist. You mentioned some other hip hop artists. I hope that Lecrae guy takes off. He could maybe make something of himself.
He may be able to do something.
Maybe give it time. And but why do you believe it's important to understand the stories? Of course, I want to mention songs that you've written that are so story driven, but our stories and where we come from, because that's a key part of the book.
Yeah. I just believe that stories in itself are an aspect of identity formation. I feel like, there are things that you've been told as a child, or we are told as children, that stick with us. And in some ways it's watered, and it bursts in us this audacity to do something and to become a particular thing. My mother told me that I looked good in red. To this day, I think red is one of my favorite colors. My father told me and my brother that we were good athletes. My brother better than I, but up until about college, I thought I was good enough to play in the NFL. I sadly was never that talented, but my father's affirmation made me feel that way. And when I think about theology, when I think about the things that we do within culture, good and bad, the stories we tell, the things that we say about one another stick to people. And that forms a belief about not only what you think about yourself, but it also creates this canvas, this picture of what you think God is, or who you think him to be, and you carry that with you. And so for me, the way we talk about work, the way we talk about identity, the way we talk about creativity, I think creates an indelible impact in the listener and informs how they're going to go about their outward testimony of what they believe God to be through their work, through their life, through their actions. And so another small thing is that I didn't want to just talk about stories, but in the book, I have some short stories some short fiction stories that I created, because I wanted people to see, just like, oftentimes I get frustrated when I go to Christian creative conferences and there's just a bunch of pastors talking about creativity, but nobody's actually demonstrating creativity. And so I wanted to show, like, hey man, these are ways in which we can be creative and tell stories, et cetera, et cetera.
Sean, I mean, what you're saying is that what I hear you saying is that so much of our creativity is shaped by narrative, and personal narrative and history even. And my heritage is I'm Hmong. My parents immigrated here in '79, and I grew up in inner city Detroit. And so most of my upbringing was in predominantly African American communities. And so, in high school, I read Maya Angelou, James Baldwin, Alex Haley, Langston Hughes. These were my prophets.
Come on.
And for me, that was just history, and then later I found out that was Black history, but actually it was just American history, right? Help us think about that, especially church leaders, especially those who in this past year, they just learned about some historic events in the United States that involved African Americans, like the Tulsa Massacre. For a lot of people, that was a new thing. Juneteenth was a new thing. Help us think through about why history is important, specifically for church leaders as they shape and mold their congregation.
Well, I think it's multi-layered and faceted. To your point, I think history, as Carter G. Woodson talks about it, I'm not gonna butcher it, but the father of Black History Month, he said that history is not just a collection of facts. It's for us to create a reasonable implication of the facts that we are gathering. So what has history told us about ourselves? And so therefore, if we hope for true reconciliation and repair in this nation, then we have to deal with the truth of our history, right? And until we do that, we're going to continue to have disharmony, disintegration within the family of God. One way that I see that is I spent enough time in seminary just to be dangerous enough to say crazy stuff, right? But in my short period of time there, I realized when we talk about church history, when we talk about the contribution of great luminaries in the past, we never mention people outside of like old dead white men. And when we talk about, we can even go even further than that, when we talk about American history or Christian history outside of this country, you would never think that Africa or Asia had any great contribution to church history, when there were a majority of the great theologians of our day, church fathers, were from North Africa. And the fact that we got to say North Africa in itself is somewhat of I think, an interesting paradigm. But not only that there were thriving churches in sub-Saharan Africa, that there were thriving churches in Africa and Asia, even after Constantine's rise. But we never talk about church history in the East. Like, what we do is we talk about the disciples, we talk about the apostles, we talk about the Roman church, and then we move north. But we never move east or south.
Yeah.
And so how much of a blessing would it be if churches uniformly just talked about the blessing of Asia and Africa and the influence that they had about in Western European and European theologians? But not only that, I think there's another component to understanding this dynamic tethering of justice in Christian faith. Like, when you look at the American Christian, and if you want to see a great tethering of what it means to have a physical faith and a mental, spiritual faith, you look no further than the African-American Christian tradition, where there were people who struggled with liberation, not only in a mental sense, in a spiritual sense, but in a physical sense. And yet and still, they still had faith to believe that God was not only going to liberate them in some sort of spiritual way, but he was good enough to give them physical liberation as well. And so when we look through the Black Christian tradition, I think you see a very balanced perspective of what it means to love God, not only with your heart, but with your body and with your mind and with your actions as well. And to separate, to ignore that, to ignore that rich Christian tradition, I feel like we're losing out as a church family. We need to hear the Luthers. We need to hear the Wesleys, but we also need to listen to the Tubmans. We also need to hear the Lemuel Hayneses. We need to hear the Jarena Lees. These are people who had very credible voices, and I think would benefit evangelicalism on a wide scope.
Well, hey, Sho, and I think a part of this is, I think this is where you can help our listeners they're primarily church leaders and they lead churches and Christian organizations. But I think a big part of that is the paradigm for ministry that you're talking about is artistry and creativity. So, which is different for many people because their paradigm for ministry is speaking and organizational leadership.
Yeah.
Like Ed and I, we play the guitar. We play musical instruments, but I don't
How
think
do you
of
know
myself
I play guitar? I've never told you I play
well,
guitar.
no,
Okay.
yeah.
Have I?
Eventually
Okay.
worship a couple days ago.
Yeah, I was like the worst worship leader ever. So, all right, good.
But so, like we don't consider ourselves artists.
No. I'm sorry. Maybe you do, but I don't.
And so our paradigm for ministry isn't artistry.
Right. It is. It is didactic teaching and
Yes.
leadership. And I have a daughter who's at the University of Toronto studying vocal performance, doing a master's degree, and I envy people like her and people like Sho, but that's not my world.
And in some ways, we have so much pressure to speak with accuracy and a polishedness, but like art doesn't work that way. So help pastors, church leaders think through like how do they work better with artists in their organizations so that they can not stifle them, so that they could actually be released to do more.
Yeah, because our audience is pastors and church leaders, and so that would help us. So how talk to them from a perspective of an artist who's speaking for artists that they want to engage and help flourish.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. I'm gonna start with the simple, and then I'm gonna get real revolutionary and almost probably ridiculous. So let's
Are you
start
going to
with the
use
simple,
words
simple.
that I'm going to have to bleep out because
I may have to, so just keep the delay on.
Yeah,
keep
sorry.
the 5-second delay. I think the easiest thing is you can learn from artists in how you communicate. I think I encourage a lot of my friends who are preachers and communicators to read fiction because fiction helps them play with the description of words and set ambiance and milieu and all those great things. It's like, how do you tell a story without just saying, I walked down the street? You know what I mean? Like, tell me what the street was like. What did you feel? Because ultimately what you're doing as pastors and church leaders, you're preaching to the heart and you want to pull the emotion out of people. So you want to disarm them in a way. And art does a wonderful job of disarming people and getting people comfortable so that they can receive some sort of truth. And so you can learn from artists just by engaging more art and work and not just listening or reading, but I'm talking about engaging it and trying to figure out how do I play with this in some way. The other thing I would say is finding ways to partner with creatives in the church space. I find that there's this interesting if I was on another podcast, the words I usually say is I'll just say it, this prostitution, if you will. There's this prostitution of positions. Oftentimes, pastors are prostituting artists, and artists try to prostitute the church for their own benefits, right? So you have church leaders who want the great artists and great talent to come to be at their church so that they can bring more people. But that's all they really want them for. They don't, there's not real autonomy or liberty to do things outside of just being a marketing ploy. But then there are artists who use the church just for their own benefit. They have no intentions in serving. They have no intentions in really being committed to the local church and actually giving of their talents or receiving blessings from people in the congregation. And I think there has to be some real open communication on how do we exist with extremely talented people who may get bored in our church what I mean is not just the Sunday service, but I mean in the context of what we do as a body that serves our community and city. The last thing, which is a lot more revolutionary, but which is really not that revolutionary at all, because the early church did it, is how do we patronize artists, support them, and be somewhat of a support agent, as my friend Byron Johnson took me around to raise support so that he didn't have to take on another vocation in order to be effective on a college ministry. Well, a lot of artists, especially in the time of COVID, is it possible? Do you have the type of, and this is large churches, obviously, and churches who have the kind of financial capacity to be able to take on an artist's residency and say, hey, we just want to support you with this amount a year. Go and be great. Go and make some great art, influence the culture. And I think that would be revolutionary in some ways. And you'll find that I think that there would be great synergy, if you will, with churches and artists. But but I do think it takes a lot of honesty. It takes a lot of, I guess you can say, honest conversation, honest expectation. It's just real talk and real dialogue. But those are the three things that just came to mind.
No, I love those three things. Because I want to, I think Daniel put it so clearly. This is not my world, though I'm blessed by this world. I'm blessed by your art. I'm blessed by the art of others. But I don't want to, just use it in a transactional way. My daughter's taught me so much about things I don't even notice about music and more. So I want to learn more. But I also recognize, you quote C.S. Lewis, that art story helps us to steal past watchful dragons who otherwise, there's a whole world of people who don't think like me. They think far more like you. And cultural creatives, very famous book on the subject. And so but I don't want this to be a transactional thing. I want art, at Moody Church, where I serve as interim, we had, artists connected and artists who were part of what we're doing. We actually sponsored art shows, but that's unusual. That's an urban church with a long history of things like that. What are some things you've seen church leaders, that's our audience, church leaders and pastors do? Maybe an example or two where you've seen them helpful support. I mean, you talk about doing it. What are some examples you've seen?
Well, there's been times when my brother who is a pastor, my brother and I.
Your brother is somebody I know.
He's just this guy who works for NAM and Sin. He's not that important.
I've heard of him. That's why I don't think that.
He's my brother Dottie. He's a great dude. He has partnered with me in many ways and other artists and given artists platforms. Honestly, and I'll say this, and I don't think this is a stretch. And I think Lecrae would say this as well. I don't think there's a Lecrae, a Tadashi, a Sho, unless my brother gives us the platforms that he gave us. That we had a church. He carved out a space so that we can create a music studio in that church. He let us put concerts and shows on whenever we wanted to. He let us create short films for the students. So even me as a filmmaker, I used to do a weekly, I guess you could say, drama series for college students that they love. So he was giving me the opportunity to develop my film and television passion. There were times where he helped fund projects. So so I've seen churches do similar things like that, and I think it's easy. It's easy. Yeah, I don't think it's that difficult, and I think people have the imagination. Now you have churches who actually want their church worship teams to make albums, right?
Yeah.
But there are more than just musicians. What about the painters? What about the dancers? What about the writers? Like, how are you giving platform and opportunity for those folks, and how are the artists themselves also committing to the church? Because I don't want to make it seem like the church leaders just have to give money and platform. It's like, in some ways, the artist has to be faithful to the local body and the local community. But I've seen it in those ways. I'm sure I'm missing out some great examples, but off the top, that's how I've been blessed. I know.
Well, I think a part of that also is the artists tend to be prophetic. I mean, they tend to
absolutely
speak back to the church and remind church and church leaders, what they're not being faithful to. And I don't want to put this on you, Sho, but a lot of your friends that you mentioned, Lecrae, Adam Thomason, who's a friend of mine as well, they've been very prophetic against evangelical subcultures. And I'm not asking for you to speak, for them or on their behalf, but from your perspective, as you're thinking about just the culture of evangelicalism today, and even based on some of the songs that you've written, help us to think better and how to really see ourselves as evangelicals.
Yeah. So there's so much. There's so much to that answer. There's different positions. There are people who are, I don't know, decolonizing, deconstructing, or removing themselves altogether from evangelicalism. There are those people who are putting their foot down in evangelicalism. Then I feel like I am a third person. I am the type of person who recognizes that evangelicalism is not owned by, I guess you can say, our white brothers and sisters. there's a wonderful book, Doctrine and Race, by, I can't remember, Mary Sweetum, I think her name is, but it just talks about the history of Black evangelicalism and fundamentalism. And the one thing that I've learned, and in my study and research, is that evangelicalism goes back, within the Black church to pretty much the Reconstruction. You can trace it that far. And so when we're talking about church history, once again, what I see is that there is a faithfulness of people who, and of course, the Black church has its problem, or Black churches, I hate to say the Black church like there's one, but Black churches have their problems, white churches have their problems. But what you can see is that throughout the history of Black churches, there has been a fidelity to Scripture. There has also been a faithfulness to justice and issues that plague the people that usually attend those types of churches. And so what happens is when we look at the last 4 or 5 years and people say, well, this is evangelicalism. To me, that's lazy, it's dishonest. And it's also, I think it's unfair, not only just to Black evangelicalism, but I think it's unfair to white evangelicalism and Christian faith in general, where there's been a history of people who have been of multiple races, multi-ethnic backgrounds, who have fought on the side of justice, whether we talk about Catholicism to Orthodox to evangelical, Protestant, whatever. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is I am at a position where I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done, a lot of social work that needs to be done around the stigmas and why white evangelicals seem to have this marriage to white nationalism that I think is quite dangerous and nasty. But also there has to be a sense of hospitality from those Black brothers, brown brothers, Asian brothers who are and sisters who are out there, who know that reconciliation is not a luxury. That's not something that we have an option to pass over. And so if I had more time, basically, I would try to expand on it. But basically what I'm trying to say is I look at reconciliation. We must tell the truth. But at the same time, we can't be a bunch of Jonahs where we are frustrated by God's calling us to preach reconciliation, redemption to a people who we felt have offended us. And then once we see that they are desiring to be family, we welcome them in, and we act as such. And then we talk about the Garden of Eden, trying to get back to this idea of this kind of utopia. But the reality is we exist more in a Garden of Gethsemane, where there's tension, there's difficulty, there's betrayal, but yet and still Jesus decides to go to the cross. And so are we in this garden deciding to go to the cross for the benefit of our brothers and sisters and love, despite the differences that we have? And it's hard, it's difficult. And that doesn't mean we're silent on issues. That doesn't mean you take everything, but that means that no matter what, I call out the ridiculousness while at the same time having an extended hand of reconciliation.
Call out the ridiculousness. The book you mentioned is Doctrine and Race, African American Evangelicals and Fundamentalism Between the Wars. It's actually got a lot of attention recently and an important conversation that's there. Okay, so call out the ridiculousness. So as a pastor who gets up and talks through a text and who leads a complex organization, who is not an artist, and I actually tried to sketch something once, and that was as close as I got. And I did, I preached at Saddleback. I play guitar. Did you know that? Mm-hmm. I broke out my guitar. It was just for a little illustration. That's all I did. It was terrible. They literally probably edited it out. But here's my point. Pastors and church leaders is mostly our audience. Think of themselves as the one who bring the word to the church, the prophetic word, the corrective word, the directive word. And I've heard a lot of pastors say, worship leaders, just sing. We don't need you to talk. And then artists, we can go across all kinds of things. There is a long tradition in evangelicalism and in broader culture to say we don't need to hear from anyone like an artist who can speak prophetically into us. But part of that in your book and in your writing and in your performing is you have been that. This is how I got to know you. You have been a prophetic voice in the midst of all these things. So in your book, again, I mentioned the Doctrine and Race book, but in your book, he saw that it was good, reimagining your creative life to repair a broken world. You do deal with the brokenness. You deal with the necessity of repair and more. Why is that an imperative for you? and for artists to speak up, speak out, and to work towards that repair, and to just make it obvious that there is brokenness needs to be addressed.
I think as Daniel said, he talked about artists being prophetic, and I
Yeah.
think the one thing is that there's a sense of like we have some artists, we don't have the weight that pastors have, institutional weight, shall we say, of having to be concerned with like watching every single word we say. And I think there's a bit of not only just liberty in that, but I think there's a bit of a breath of fresh air. Like even with comedians, people will say that they're the last truth tellers. And it goes back to this idea that I think it is very important that we allow artists to be artists and to tell the truth about society, because artists and creatives actually move culture. A lot of people think politicians do it and thinkers, but when you get the artist to believe in something and to communicate something, then the culture moves in that direction. And the more we ostracize and we push creatives to the margins, the church will find itself continuing to fight culture wars that are dated, and you're left behind. Nobody's having that argument anymore, because your artists are now being swept by every wind of doctrine because you didn't allow them to have a voice or a space in your particular church. And so now they're getting platforms and spaces where there's doctrines of demons, if you will. And so for me, it's not just even about artists. The reason why I think this book is important for people outside of the artist realm is because we all are creating in some form or fashion. We look at Genesis, the mandate is to go and cultivate, multiply, right? To subdue the world. And so you're an engineer, you're creating something. You're a teacher, you're cultivating and you're creating students. You're a scientist. And so in what you're doing, how are you bringing flourishing and shalom to the world? Oftentimes we feel like work is agnostic. It's not agnostic. Every belief, every swing of the hammer is informed by somebody's belief. You may not know what that is, but guess what? You're swinging it because somebody is paying you to swing it. And if you don't have a belief behind your swing, then I think that is probably one of the most dangerous things to do. As an artist, when I write a song, I know why I'm writing. I know there's an end, what the end goal is. And I would hope as educators, as thinkers, as engineers, as scientists, they're processing through, why am I doing this? Is it for the glory of God? Is it going to bring peace? Is it going to bring shalom to the world? And if that's the case, then I think we have a better society. I'll sum it up with it. I have this analogy that I often use about Marvel. I love Marvel movies. It's one of the few things that me and my family can all watch, teenagers, and Tony Stark is a very important character in the Marvel world. He's also Iron Man. Iron Man flies around the world saving people, and but Iron Man has to save people because Tony Stark is the one who creates the problem. The same person, right? And it's so interesting. If Tony Stark just worked better, he wouldn't have to put on a suit and go save people around the world. And in the same way, the Christian paradigm often acts like this. We contribute to great detriment in our society, but then we want to get on planes and save the world. Well, if we just had a better theology of work, if we just worked better, we wouldn't need to get on planes. We wouldn't need to get on put on capes and be great missionaries if we didn't contribute to the imperialism, the colonialization, the capitalist greed that we promote within our societies. Live better, work better, think better, and then a lot of the detriment and brokenness that we see would probably fix itself.
Love that thought. A better theology of work and practice. And hey, you embody that well as an artist, activist, and now writer. You've been listening to Sho Baraka. His debut book is called He Saw That It Was Good, Reimagining Your Creative Life to Repair a Broken World. Hey, thanks for listening to the Stetzer Church Leaders podcast. You can find more interviews as well as other great content for ministry leaders at ChurchLeaders.com. And if you found our conversation today helpful, we'd love for you to take a few moments to leave us a comment or review on iTunes, and that'll help other ministry leaders find us more easily. And also, I want to remind you again that Amplify Outreach Conference is coming soon, so make sure you go to amplifyoutreach.com to learn more. We'll see you on the next episode.
You've been listening to the Stetzer Church Leaders Podcast. For more great interviews, as well as articles, videos, and free resources, visit our website at ChurchLeaders.com. Thanks for listening.